I have found David, my servant. With my holy oil have I anointed him, with whom my hand shall be established. Mine arm also shall strengthen him. The enemy shall not exact upon him, nor the son of wickedness afflict him. And I will beat down his foes before his face, and plague them that hate him. Invasion, devastation, destruction, death, and replacement. These are the 5 things that the Seljuk Turks brought with them to Sakartvelo. Starting with only a small raid, Georgia had been severely reduced in size, power, and royal authority in the years immediately following the Battle of Manzikert. Now, with an ineffective ruler steering the Georgian kingdom ever closer to extinction, it was all but assured that they would be fully consumed into the Seljuk Empire. Here, on their last chance of hope, the fate of Georgia rested in the young hands of an eager, yet inexperienced, 16-year-old prince. From ashes to empire, for his vital role in Georgian history, he would forever be known as King David the Rebuilder, the Sword of the Messiah. David IV Bagrationi was born in the ancient city of Kutaisi in 1073. We think. His date of birth remains a mystery as the years following were filled with utter chaos. The documents regarding his most formative years were likely lost in the flames of a Seljuk siege. David's mother is also left mostly a mystery to us. Her name was Eileen, and that's about all we know about her. Her name only appears once as a note inside of a Bible. By the time of his birth, his father, King George II, had only been king of Georgia for a short year. And in that time, he had watched as Georgia's only robust ally, the Byzantine Empire, lost most of interior Anatolia to the Seljuk Empire. But he was not to remain the only important George in the young king's life. I mean, does that surprise anyone? This is Georgia we're talking about here. George of Chalkindidi, a churchman and bishop by trade, who would become the religious tutor for the only child of the king. David and his teacher would develop a healthy relationship, and the prince proved to be extremely pious and well read on his scriptures. This mentor-student relationship was perhaps the most important connection that a young David ever made. As we will soon find out, George of Chalkindidi knew a thing or two more than just the Bible. The young life of David IV would be one filled with a constant and growing threat in the form of the Seljuk Empire, that his father simply could not contain. In 1076, the Seljuks launched their first massive full-scale invasion of Georgia, and it only got worse from there on out. Eventually, it got so bad that a 7-year-old David would be pushed out of the capital in 1080, when a Seljuk army looted and practically leveled Kutaisi. In the following year, King George II made the embarrassing and unpopular decision to travel far to the city of Esfahan to meet with Sultan Malik Shah himself, and turn his country over to become an ally to the invaders. Leaving with this deal, George thought himself and his country safe for the time being, but he was wrong. No longer was it to be the Sultan's armies, but now it was the various hordes of nomadic peoples looking for a lush and untouched pasture in the form of the Georgian plains. Year after year, they took more and more land from the now mostly inactive King George. Even the neighboring country and Georgian king of Kakheti Hareti converted to Islam and allied with the Seljuks. While officially Georgia looked like this, with all these new Seljuk settlers, the political map of Georgia looked more like this, and shrinking with every raid. It looked as if the Kingdom of Georgia would disappear before reaching its centennial year. And that's when the land itself started rejecting their king. On the auspicious day of Easter, a 6.5 magnitude earthquake shook southern Georgia, killing hundreds and felling nearby church steeples and fortresses left and right. But this earthquake continued in some part on and off for nearly an entire year. While the earth trembled, not all in Georgia could say the same. Even at this low point, David knew that Georgia could be restored and rebuilt. The only thing in his way was his own incompetent father. In 1089, just as the ground was beginning to settle, King George II would be interrupted by his son and his princess tutor, George of Chondidy. This was unalarming enough, but the look on both of their faces was different, as was the retinue of armed soldiers behind them. Here, David IV overthrew his father and supplanted himself as King of Georgia. The whole affair having been bloodless and as smooth as a palace coup could go. There are many different tellings for how exactly David IV came to the throne at 16 years of age. While many believe the story I just told, there are others who suggest that King George II willingly abdicated his throne in favor of his only child. While still, there are others who believe David was only appointed co-king, alongside his father, until 1112, when George II died. No matter the case, the end result would be all the same. A coronation ceremony was held where George II would personally place the crown of Georgia onto the head of the new king. King George would remain at the side of his son for the rest of his life, staying as an advisor for the hefty task he had just let him inherit. With the crown jewels acquired, the time to rebuild had come. But where does one start in all this ruin? To say that Georgia was on the edge of collapse would be an understatement. First and foremost, there was the looming Seljuk threat. But besides that, a large portion of the Georgian nobility were as greedy and ambitious as they ever came. David's ancestors having fought protracted civil wars and backdoor deals to keep them happy. Another problem remained at large with the economy having collapsed. With the Turks taking most of rural Georgia, the Kartvelians started moving behind the protection of city walls, leading to a slashing in annual harvests and, as a result, a mass and costly importation of food to feed the urban population. After overthrowing his own father easily, it became clear that the Bagrationi crown had lost much respect since the foundation of Georgia. With Kutaisi sacked, the only truly untouched crown lands that David still held was in Abkhazia. And if you can't stymie your own nobles with fiefs and lands, they'll just do it themselves. Georgia was also alone in terms of allies, with the now useless Byzantines and the loyal Alans being the only friend of the Kartvelians. Underlying all of this, of course, was a huge population crisis, with many of the men having died defending against the Great Turkish Invasion. But of course, Georgia was not the only nearby country brought to its knees by the Seljuks. Nearby Armenia, the Eastern Caucasus, and Roman Anatolia had already fallen, with many of these groups fleeing to the safety of Georgia. But they were not enough to fix the population problem and actually led to the weakening of the Georgian Church, with Muslims, Apostolic Armenians, and Orthodox Greeks all practicing another form of the faith. Attendance in the still-standing churches was at an all-time low. This low attendance in turn led to corruption over the vast estates held by the church. By this point, church lands were more numerous than most of the land of the high-ranking nobles. From this list of problems, where do you even begin? David IV consecrated his reign by seeking to destroy the root of all of these problems. The Seljuk threat had to be expelled in full. The thing about facing a nomadic horde with the smaller and primarily infantry-focused army is that you will lose almost every single time, unless your opponent makes a mistake and you hold some vital strategic geography. King George had always made this same mistake, confronting the horsemen in open battle many times over his life while only seeing a handful of victories from it. But if the Georgians continued fighting in this manner, a few more defeats would destroy, and a few more victories would only prove to be Pyrrhic. There was to be no more pitched battles against the invaders. Instead, David IV opted to adopt a Fabian strategy. The Georgian army would be split into much smaller groups who would then conduct guerrilla warfare on Seljuk units and settlements alike. He also revamped the entire military structure, creating a personal year-round standing army of the king, who would be called the Manaspa Guard. He also separated the military in two. The garrisons and foot soldiers would now be fully split in terms of management. Without the fortresses slowing them down, the small bands of Georgians were free to march where they please. Using their own tactics against them, the Georgians slowly but surely started to reclaim interior Sakartvelo. Soon enough, the Seljuk Sultan, who had become the bane of his father, Malik Shah, opened negotiations with the resurgent Georgia and its young king. He gave David IV the same deal he had given George II when he had personally traveled to Esfahan. The Georgians would pay a yearly tribute in exchange for peace and a cessation of the Turkic invasions. And just like before, the Seljuk hordes never stopped invading Georgia. But this time, instead of standing idly by, David IV continued his guerrilla warfare and even started to take his tactics onto the offensive. The Seljuk situation only improved in 1092, when Sultan Malik Shah was assassinated whilst on a hunting trip. This would lead his 4-year-old son to become the new Sultan. What followed would be a succession dispute that would momentarily tear the Seljuks apart, giving the Georgians some much-needed breathing room and taking the Turkish priorities in the Caucasus away for the time being. Shortly after the Seljuks finished their civil war, a greater threat than themselves or a resurgent Georgia reared its head from the west. The Crusades had just begun. As Western knights conquered the Levant, they found an easy ally in the oh-so-coincidentally named King David. David already styled himself after the biblical king of Jerusalem. But with the knights of Europe starting their own war with the Seljuks, they saw a mutual Goliath in need of slaying. This has led many to speculate that King David IV was actually the fictional character Prester John, a Christian king from the Far East who would conjoin his army with that of the Crusaders and claim victory over the infidels. But there's also a lot more people who might fit that description better, so just keep that in mind. With the First Crusade ending in 1099 as a resounding victory, taking Jerusalem and forming the Crusader states, King David of Georgia decided that this century would be the last time the Georgians paid tribute to the Seljuks. By 1100, Georgia had ended its first chapter of restoration under their new king. The Seljuks were still a huge threat, but the Kartvelians were beginning to change the tides. While David was contending with the Seljuks, he was simultaneously rearing his own nobility. The most loyal and more recently, most unloyal lords in Georgia were the Bagushi family, who remained as the Dukes of Klidkati. Long ago, during the reign of David's great-grandfather, Duke Liptarit III of Klidkati, gave his life for the king in a battle. But his grandson, Liptarit IV, had plagued the reign of David's grandfather, where he practically became the king of Georgia for a short time. Now his own grandson, Liptarit V, was plotting against the Bagrationi crown. Although he had initially sided with the new king, in 1093 Duke Liptarit converted to Islam, pledged his allegiance to the Seljuks, and began a revolt. With only a few nobles choosing to side against the king, the Manaspa Guard defeated him and took the duke captive. David IV, in attempts to not make another Bagushi martyr, chose to imprison this noble, and only for a short 2 years, hoping to allow forgiveness to heal the wounds of their ancestors. This did not work. In 1095, as soon as he got out of jail, Liptarit revolted again. Again, David crushed this rebellion and imprisoned the duke, this time for 3 years. Seeing that more of the same would follow, David IV exiled Duke Liptarit V in 1098, where he would be sent in exile and house arrest to the Georgian ally in Constantinople. The Byzantines at this point were enjoying their own rebuild in the east, as they had reconquered the region of Trebizond and now held a land border with their Christian ally in the Caucasus. A favorable position for both, at least for now. To fully suppress the Bagushi family, King David made a deal with Liptarit's son, Rati. He was to remain as duke for his life, but upon his death the Duchy of Klitkari would be absorbed into the Bagrationi crown lands. The other nobles who sided with Liptarit in his 2 short-lived rebellions would have their territory immediately confiscated as well. Duke Rati would die in 1103, adding more weight to the Bagrationi crown. With these new palaces, David did not simply make them vacation homes, but created something of a moving capital under himself, leaving his loyal general, Theodore, in charge of the bureaucracy in Kutaisi. King David made it a point to travel for a large portion of the year, taking hunting trips with his nobles in many parts of the country and building a more personable loyalty system. The lords now respected and knew the man they pledged their life protecting. With the Seljuks pushed from the gates and the Georgian nobility quelled at last, King David could turn his gaze to reforming the very fabric of religion. In 1103, the dual councils of Rusi Urbanici were held. The powerful and now corrupted Georgian Orthodox Church would undergo something of a purging, although conducted in a peaceful manner. Many of the church lands were taken and parceled out to the nobility or the king himself. And to merge both church and state, David created a new position in the government for his lifelong teacher, George of Chonditi. His official title was... oh my god. Okay, I'm gonna try to say this. Here we go. Chondidol Mitsignobartukatesesi. Okay, let's move on from that. This title would become the second most powerful in Georgia for the following decades, behind only the king. Being the practical head of the church and right hand of the king would turn Georgia into something of a theocratic monarchy. Exactly the thing David IV needed to convert church power into state power. David decided to more formally give his nobles a voice and created the Darbazi. This functioned as a non-mandatory annual meeting of the nobility, council, and king to sort out any issues. It largely acted as a parliament and was to be of much use to the future kings of Georgia. On top of reordering the nobles, he also gave them a powerful new and hereditary role to fill in his government, the Emir Specialar, or the Marshal. The first of these marshals would be Duke Ivan Orbeli, leading to the rise of the Orbeli noble house in Georgia. These men, on top of being the marshals, also held many forts in southern Georgia. The Orbeli family were of mixed Georgian and Armenian origin. Getting a slight outsider to the politics of the Georgian nobles was simply a highly intelligent move that would pay off for a while. Now, with church, state, and military working in tandem on either of his sides, David was prepared to unify the Kartvelians as his great-great-grandfather Bagrat III had in his unification campaigns. Besides reclaiming more Seljuk-held Sakartvelo proper, there was another land of Georgians in the east, the kingdom of Kakheti-Hereti, and their Islamic king, Kivrake IV. An ally to the Seljuks and former friend of the Bagrationi, were the next target for King David. The sword of the Messiah would finally be unsheathed in its full capacity. A large army was assembled for campaign for the first time in over a decade. He chose only to make a jab to start, though, cautiously testing his fellow Kartvelians. After a short siege, David IV and his army took the fortress of Zetazeni in the far north, opening up a pass that could allow for future campaigns. After this, the campaign halted as a success. Only a year later, King Kivrake would die, and the throne would be passed on to his nephew, Agsartan II. During his short reign, he would manage to do the complete opposite of David, turning the nobles against him by means of incredible amounts of greed. Soon enough, these nobles, looking over at the jolly court of King David, arrested Agsartan II and escorted him in chains to the King of Georgia, who promptly imprisoned him, accepted the submission of the aristocracy, and annexed the kingdom of Kakheti-Hereti as a whole. Having fought a single siege and won the war, David IV did not celebrate, but moved to protect the new front he had just opened with the Seljuk Empire. The repercussions of taking a vassal from the grasps of the Seljuks would see the new Sultan, Berk Yaruk, send an army to retake Kakheti-Hereti. Outnumbered, King David marched to meet a Seljuk army for the first time in his 30 years of life, and he would not disappoint. The only source that remains for the Battle of Artsuki are the Georgian Chronicles, which served to paint King David as if he was the warrior king from the Bible. So take some of these more unbelievable things with a grain of salt, but don't completely discredit them. During the chaos of battle, David led from the front lines, striking kill blows left and right. 3 of his horses were cut down from under him, but still the king escaped every attempt on his life. Upon taking his 4th horse, the king unsheathed his sword that no longer glinted but had a layer of congealed blood concealing the shine. With frontline valor, David fought a ferocious victory and Georgia destroyed a Seljuk army for the first time in decades. Upon taking his victory, the weary king removed his armor, to the horror of all onlookers. A flow of blood fell from his midsection and made a large puddle around his own feet. Nearby retainers quickly checked David for wounds, but there were none to be found but a few bruises. The King of Georgia had killed so many men that day, his armor filled with his opponent's blood. With the Seljuks fended off and the Kartvelians unified under one banner at last, the day to rebuild Georgia had come. David funded the repair of the churches which had been devastated by collapse or fire in the Timogvi earthquake and the Seljuk invasions. He also began the construction of Jaladi Monastery, one of the most well-preserved medieval Georgian churches and a current-day UNESCO World Heritage Site. He also gave incentives for Georgians to reconstruct their villages and return to a rural lifestyle, thereby returning Georgia to a more classic feudal style of rule. King David, who was said to be something of a scholar himself, made it a point to construct many religious and even some secular schools. With help from George of Chonditi, the Georgians were becoming ever more literate. Large amounts of art at this time period began to pop up, showing the region underwent a period of advancement with the society as a whole. Even still, to prevent the Seljuks from invading Georgia again, David reinforced and constructed many fortress walls. Little by little, life in Georgia was returning to normality. This architect even sped up his defense project as in 1105, a new and ambitious Seljuk Sultan came to the throne, Muhammad Tapar. With the west of Seljuk lands lost to the Crusaders or rebellions, this Sultan made it a particular priority to control the Caucasus region and undo all that King David had done. While the Seljuks were brooding, David IV began looking for a new and powerful ally that could help him defeat the Turks. And who better than another fierce Turkic empire? In recent years, the Cuman-Kipchak Confederation was forming an empire in the Eurasian steppe, just to the north of Georgia. Now, they would be a valuable ally. King David was so sure of this alliance paying off that he divorced his first wife, an otherwise unknown woman of apparent Armenian origin named Rusadan. After doing this, he traveled to the far north, praying for his plans to become fruition. In front of his new and powerful father-in-law, Chief Otrok, he married his daughter, who is only known by her baptized name of Garandukt. In exchange for this, David promised to defend the Kipchaks against the long-term Georgian ally of Alania, flipping a no longer strategically viable friendship. The Kipchaks of course did their part, agreeing to defend Georgia from the Seljuks, if called upon. This was a great day for Georgia, but soon enough it would come with its own complications. David is believed to have 5 children through his first marriage, including his firstborn son and crown prince, Demetrius. But with this new marriage, they would produce but one child, who just happened to be another boy, named Vaktang. Now, with 2 different sons to 2 different women, he had created a future problem, although one he would personally not have to deal with. With Georgia reclaimed and rebuilt, it was time for a grand reconquista of not only the core lands of Georgia, but all former lands the Bagrationi had possessed throughout the centuries. While the Seljuks and Georgians were preparing for another long war, the hour was nigh for King David to slay his Goliath. In the smog of a smoky night, with no moon in sight, vanished some weeks ago since a massive volcanic cluster erupted halfway around the world. A desperate king of Georgia takes his chance and makes the march through the unknown of the dark. The Turks were coming, and if he did not block the horde, their devastation would know no bound. With only 1,500 infantry at his command, everything that David IV Bagrationi had done to restore his war-torn kingdom waned in the winds of these few brave men. Just before dawn broke, the Georgians reached their objective, a mountain pass that, if held properly, could prevent the Turks from even entering Georgia. The gates of Trialeti had been filled and slammed shut. When the sun beamed through the volcanic ash, the Seljuk host came into view. Perhaps this would be enough to pry open Georgia by force. But there was only one way to find out. The Seljuks attacked and did what they could to push the Georgians back, but all attempts were turned away. Eventually, the Seljuk army gave up and withdrew, hoping for an easier and less defended entrance into Georgia. King David, ignorant to the fact that he had just won an inspiring defense, stayed at Trialeti Pass for an entire night. His soldiers made a proper camp, buried their dead, and shored up defenses, preparing for another assault at dawn. But like the moon on these fateful nights, the Seljuks were nowhere to be found. King David IV was such a good general he didn't even know when he won this battle. Although this defense of Georgia was not a completely innocent one this time, The tables had finally turned in the preceding decades under David, and this Seljuk attack was only a response for a Georgian offensive made a few months earlier. Here, David's Grand Chancellor and lifelong tutor, George of Chonditi, alongside the Marshal of Georgia, Ivan Orbeli, captured the city fortress of Samshvildi, just a stone's throw away from the ancient Georgian capital of Tbilisi. With the recent victory, David would ensure that this key castle would stay in Georgian hands. With the Seljuks gone west, the king and his army continued east, raiding the Seljuk vassals of Lori and Aran, even going as far as besieging Aran's capital of Ganja. However, this siege would see a rare withdrawal for the so far undefeated Seljuk Slayer. Another Turkish army, this time sent by Sultan Muhammad Tapar, would arrive on the scene. In enemy territory, David made the wise decision to march back to his newly acquired citadel. This campaign not achieving what he had wished, but remaining a success nonetheless. Around a year later, the King of Georgia passed away. But don't worry, it was only David's father and former monarch that he had overthrown some 15 years ago, George II. The former king stayed on to continue being a parent for David as well as a more than loyal advisor. After the events of the Great Turkish Invasion, George II had done his part to redeem himself. Over his more than 60 years of life, he had seen Georgia brought to its knees under his reign and pick itself up under his energetic son. As he lay on his deathbed, little could he imagine the empire that David was on the precipice of creating. While the Seljuks were battling a revived Georgia, they were also contending with a large portion of the entire Christian world at the time. On the western side of this once unstoppable empire, the Crusaders were doing their part to restore their Holy Land. In 1115, the Prince Regent of Antioch, Roger of Salerno, crushed a Seljuk army at the Battle of Sarmen, leaving their realm in a particular state of weakness. Never one to miss such an opportunity, David IV took the initiative. More help from the Crusaders came in the form of an alliance with the King of Jerusalem, Baldwin of Verdun. The autocratic faces of Eastern and Western Christendom had written many times to each other, telling of Seljuk weaknesses and the like, but this next letter was way different from those that came before. That is because it was escorted by a small army of Latin knights from all around Europe. The exact figure of these knights remain in conjecture, with the consensus being that David IV either received 200 or 1,500 soldiers. No matter the number, Georgia now had her hands on the best heavy cavalry in the world. Shortly after the Seljuk defeat at Sarmen, the architect of Georgia took a step closer to reclaiming Tbilisi. In 1115, the warrior bishop, George of Chonditi, made another offensive on the emirate of Tbilisi. After a short siege, he managed to capture the city of Rustavi, thereby completely cutting off the emirate from the rest of the Islamic world. Upon learning of the seizure of Rustavi, King David ordered for part of his army to be split into guerrilla bands to raid all the Seljuk lands around the Georgian blockade of Tbilisi, thereby creating more of a buffer and, by extension, a no-man's land. With Tbilisi encircled, this campaign halted and rejoiced. David made a trip back to one of his royal residences in Abkhazia, preparing for the next chapter in his Reconquista. In February of 1116, the Georgians unexpectedly attacked the lucrative and constantly fought-over region of Tau Klarjeti. Caught off guard, the Seljuks were forced onto the defensive and began assembling their regional army along the Choraki River. But this only gave David more reason to press the attack. The Seljuk Slayer force-marched his army all the way to his disorganized foe. the Georgians had once again outmarched the cavalry-comprised armies of their nomadic foe. Without delay, David called for a charge. Soon after, the river would be filled by the corpses of Turkish soldiers. Another inspiring success, as this victory would see the region of Tau Klarjeti fall back under Bagrationi domains. Owning this lucrative and sought-after region came with its own trouble, however. We must remember that the Georgians had initially fought a war over and taken this region from the Byzantine Empire. It would serve to benefit both of these allies if the hatchet was finally buried. Shortly thereafter, according to Byzantine chronicles, a bride from Georgia arrived in Constantinople. David IV married one of his daughters, Kata, off to the Byzantines. We aren't exactly sure who she married, but most fingers can be pointed in the direction of Alexios Komnenos. No, not that one, but his grandson and future emperor, Alexios Komnenos the Younger. I believe this to be the most likely culprit for the husband of Kata, as John Komnenos, the father of Alexios the Younger, was crowned as emperor in the same year that his son was married. What better way to start off a reign than to renew an old and ever more so powerful alliance with Georgia? Shortly after the first daughter left the nest, so too did the second, Tamar. She would be married off, like in Byzantium, to the eldest son of the Shirvan Shah. His name was Manichor. Together, these two daughters would be called the luminaries of the West and the East, shining the light of Georgian influence far past its own borders. But this second marriage to the future Shirvan Shah was not made without a crooked smile. Shirvan was still technically a vassal of the Seljuks and had continued paying the yearly tribute. The shrewdness of this political marriage cannot be understated. In the following year, the Crown Prince of Georgia, Demetrius Bagrationi, was challenged by his father to earn his stripes. At the age of 24, Demetrius would lead his own campaign on Shirvan. He exceeded even the expectations of David, winning multiple battles, raiding nearly to the Caspian coast, and taking the border fortress of Gishi before returning home with wealth unimaginable. Having earned his place, Prince Demetrius became a permanent fixture in the army. Peace was made with these new in-laws after the prince's return. With Shirvan showed their new trapped position between war and alliance with the Seljuks and the Georgians, David was finding success in his own campaign against a Seljuk vassal, this one being from the previously raided kingdom of Lori. The city of Lori itself was besieged, and their king, whose name was also David, not the fourth but the second, surrendered to the king of Georgia. For this, and because he was a distant cousin of the Bagrationi, he was treated fairly and continued governing a reduced portion of his former possessions, as a Georgian vassal. With another success under the Bagrationi belt, the situation only improved in 1118, when the Seljuk Sultan died. After this, the Seljuks entered into another period of civil war and division, with the sons of the previous Sultan, Mahmud II, coming to rule over the western domains bordering Georgia, while the younger brother of the dead Sultan, Ahmad Sanjar, took over the eastern territories. From now on out, the Eastern Sultan would be co-ruler alongside 6 other men during his 40-year reign, all of which would, in reality, take orders from him. Some of the Georgian nobility, seeing the new weaknesses of their arch-nemesis, grew overconfident in their own abilities. Just to the west of Trialeti Pass, a nobleman by the name of Bekshen Jekeli, the governor of Javaketi, was killed in combat, and his army was nearly destroyed. With this single major defeat in 2 decades, a darbazi was held in Kutaisi. Nearly all of the nobles, their mouths soured by the recent loss of one of their own, were willing to surrender on contractual terms to the Seljuks. They had lost so many during this seemingly endless war, and could not stomach one more defeat. King David rejected all such cowardice offers of peace, and convinced his nobles to stay on his side. The war was so close to being won, but one more defeat like this just might make all of Georgia turn on its most beloved king. To make up for the recent setback, David decided that the only way to get the nobles fully back onto his side was to crush another Seljuk host personally. This he did a few weeks later at the Battle of the Araxes River. However, this name is slightly misleading. This fight actually occurred on one of the many tributaries of the Araxes, of which we are totally unsure of the location. Regardless, the Georgian king managed to maneuver his army in such a way so that the Seljuks were once again encamped on and pushed into a flowing river in the middle of the rainy season. Here, another stream would be filled by Turkish corpses as King David won another resounding victory. David followed this up by besieging Agarata Fortress, inching ever closer to Tbilisi. Where it had taken his own grandfather, King Bagrat IV, 3 months to take hold of this vital castle, it would only take his grandson the better part of a day. Eventually, Agarata Fort would be given as a fief to the marshal, Ivan Orbeli, something that would end up coming back to bite Georgia. Having avenged the death of Bekshin Jakeli, the Georgian nobility fell back into place at the side of their warrior king. Finally, with all the pieces set and the plans falling exactly into place, it was time for King David Bagrationi to play his trump card. Near the end of 1118, David and his right-hand man, George of Chonditi, started their journey to the far north of the Caucasus region. They didn't come to conquer, but to tie up some loose ends and call upon the other Turkish horde turned ally. After meeting the in-laws for the first time in a decade, the Cuman Kipchak Confederation was to join the war on the Georgian side. But there was one problem in both of their ways. An old ally who David had betrayed for the very alliance he needed the most. The Alans. The Alans and Cumans were not on friendly terms to say the least, but the former still looked to Georgia as its only real friend in the world. King David, Chief Hotrok, and King Athon all met to make peace in the Greater Caucasus and war in the Lesser. After much debate, it was eventually decided that Rusudan, the last unmarried daughter of David, was to be wed off to the Alanian crown prince. But this renewed alliance came with its own price for protection. The Alans would be absorbed into the Georgian realm as a vassal state. While this may sound like the end of Alania, we have yet to discuss its most important contribution in Georgian history. The Daryal Gorge, otherwise known as the Gates of the Alans, was finally opened for the Georgians to use in full. But it would not be the Georgians using this pass. Instead, it was the Cuman Kipchaks. King David presented Georgia as a bountiful yet depopulated land fit for resettlement. Many Cumans and Kipchaks chose Sakardvelo as a place to settle down, raise families, and become part of a now flourishing economy. All these newcomers had to do was fight to keep it that way when their king called. Northern Georgia, barring Abkhazia, was to become the new homeland of these former nomads. Now, I know what you're thinking. David is inviting Turks into his country to kill the Turks in his country. This can only end in one way. But David had already thought his way around the problem. Using one Turkish empire, To fight another was a way to kill two birds with one stone. Pitting them against each other made them embittered foes from here on out. We must also keep in mind just how different the Cuman Kipchaks were from the Seljuks. The former was not introduced to Islam in the same way the latter was after conquering the Middle East, meaning that the Cumans were far more willing to integrate and convert, rather than to fight. Of course, a few minor rebellions and even some assassination attempts did occur with the Cumans, but David had spread them out in such a manner that they could never muster a force large enough than the local Georgian military in that province. With an old ally turned valuable vassal and a nomadic empire at his back, David and George made the journey back home. But only one of them would return from this crucial diplomatic mission. George of Chonditi would pass away after devoting every moment of his last 40 years tutoring, advising, and leading armies for David. He was practically another father to him, and his guidance would surely be missed in the upcoming years. To commemorate the bishop's death, David wore only black for 40 days straight. George of Chonditi was the first person buried in Jalati Monastery, while it was still under construction, and remains as the only person of the 14 entombed there never to be a monarch. He would be canonized as a saint in the Georgian Orthodox Church almost a millennium later in 2005. His feast day is celebrated on September 12th. Together, David and George had done the hard work to rebuild Georgia from the ashes of the Great Turkish invasion. Now, it was up to David alone to finish this grand reconquista. The entire year of 1119 was spent by David and George's replacement, Simeon, settling in the Cuman Kipchaks on Georgian soil and integrating them into his army. The sword of the Messiah was ready to confront the Turks in a penultimate confrontation. In 1120, David left western Georgia wide open for invasion. The Seljuks took the bait, and on Valentine's Day, David gave his enemy the kiss of death. Using a very familiar strategy, he pressed his army fast enough to catch the Seljuks off guard, in their camp, and what do you know it, on the banks of a freezing cold river. The Battle of Botara was a massacre. David followed this up with 4 more surprise attacks made on the Seljuk camps just on the outskirts of southwestern Georgia. He was simply a master of his own form of mixed heavy and light cavalry guerrilla warfare. After these crushing victories in the west, David decided to fully close off the gates of the Caucasus. It was time for his own Shirvan campaign. While Crown Prince Demetrius had seen a great victory and had taken Gishi in his own campaign, David was simply looking to remove one man from the equation to put another in. The only one who needed to die, and he would just not, was the 74-year-old Shirvan Shah, Afradun. With him gone, David's own son-in-law would become the new Shah and ultimately a vassal of what was starting to look more like an empire. While Shirvan and Georgia had been the most powerful countries in the Caucasus for some time, they had rarely come to blows before the arrival of the Seljuks. Shirvan had a much more blood-soaked rival in the form of the Avars. By this point, the Avars had found their homeland in Dagestan, and thanks partly to Georgian missionaries, were converting ever more so to Christianity, although with large populations of pagans and Islam still remaining as the ruling authority, as their state was called the Emirate of Derbent. Despite this, the Avars accepted Georgian vassalage and agreed to start a joint invasion of Shirvan alongside David IV. More than just bloodshed, this was personal for the Avars, as long ago, in 1066, Afradun was the Emir of Derbent, but decided to return to Shirvan 2 years later, under mysterious reasons. David stormed through the far east of the Caucasus, capturing the prosperous city of Kabbalah. Shirvan Shah Afridun decided to eliminate the smaller threat in the form of the Avars first. He successfully marched through their lands and nearly to their capital of Derbent, before he was confronted by the might of Dagestan. At the age of 74, the Avars successfully killed Afridun in this battle, thereby ending the campaign in mere months. Afridun would thereafter be known as the Martyr, for his brave stand against enemies on all of his sides. As David had planned, his son-in-law would become Shirvan Shah Manachor III, and the Shahs of Shirvan thereafter would be descendants of David IV. A son of Manachor was even entered into the Georgian nobility as the Sharvashidze family that can still be traced all the way to currently living members today. Manachor proved loyal to David and ruled Shirvan alongside Princess Tamar for 40 years, dedicating most of his life to being a patron of the arts. With the entire Caucasus region cut off from the Seljuks, Sultan Mahmud II readied another army to face the Seljuk Slayer. The nomads found real success for the first time in decades and cut a path straight through the Georgian heartland and up to the cliffs of the Greater Caucasus Range, taking key mountain passes that practically cut Georgia in half and cut off David in Abkhazia. The king pondered strategy but knew as long as the Turks held these passes, he could do nothing but defend the west. So, David, as is the answer to many of his problems, decided to simply cut through it. Not with the sword or mace, but the pickaxe. The Georgians were practically the Tolkien dwarves of the medieval world, home to abundant mountain forts protecting large deposits of gold, and also the Georgians at that time happened to be pretty short and hairy. A large portion of Georgians were miners by trade. David IV Bagrationi cut a hole through a mountain. He then ordered his soldiers onto the other side, and in 3 months, forced the Turks all the way out of Georgia. But David did not stop there. As the Turks crossed a river and made camp, thinking themselves saved from the sword of the Messiah, they were soon met by the arrows of the Kipchaks. Testing his newly incorporated horsemen, David crossed the river and forced the Seljuks to flee even farther from Sakartvelo. With no victory lasting longer than the next battle, Sultans Ahmad Sanjar and Mahmud II were out of ideas. There was only one thing left to do to rid himself of the Christian problem in the Caucasus. Their Crusader allies had already declared for a holy war in the Levant, so why not make another? Jihad was called on Georgia. As the banners of Islam gathered in the Caucasus, they found their experienced leader, a man who had handed the Crusaders their worst defeat at the Field of Blood and killed Prince Roger of Antioch, the former Seljuk governor of Jerusalem himself. King David's Goliath would be none other than Ilghazi. With thousands of men from all over the realm at his disposal, this was believed to be the largest Seljuk invasion in Georgian history. A bold gamble, one last deciding confrontation, winner takes complete hegemony over the Caucasus region. In a valley with wooded hills on either side set almost perfectly between Trialeti and Tbilisi, the utterly outnumbered King David chose his battlefield wisely. As always, he would keep his army concealed from view, taking every advantage he could get. The might of the Islamic coalition was a sight to behold, made up of a swarm of regional vassals ranging from Armenians to Caspians, and of course, the notorious Turkish missile Cav. Opposing them were Georgia's finest swords, maces, and heavy lamellar cavalry. More infantry was supplied by King Athon of Alania, in the form of a 500-man detachment of experienced soldiers. Acclimated to fighting the might of the Cuman Kipchaks, they now fought alongside. Making up the rest of the infantry was a detachment from Shirvan, as well as some Armenian mercenaries, who had more than enough reason to join this fight. The Seljuk horse archers were to be met by Cuman Kipchaks of similar quality. 5,000 more horsemen in the form of King David's famous Manaspa Guard, who had been fighting near endlessly for over 20 years at this point. King David, who always fought at the very front of his lines, would join the charge of the greatest heavy lancers in the world. 200 Frankish knights would round out this extremely diverse and deadly army. Before diving into this battle, we need to talk about the sources. More specifically, the amount of fighting men present in both Christian and Islamic narratives of the Battle of Didgori. The only thing we are semi-sure of is the size of the Georgian army, but even still there is a range of estimates. Most historians will tell you somewhere as low as 15,000 to as many as 30,000, with the majority favoring closer to the latter option. The size of the most definitely massive Seljuk host is another problem altogether. The highest and completely improbable, quite literally due to the amount of fighting-aged men in that war-torn area at this time, is 800,000. That is ridiculous and simply not possible. But it does go to show just how outnumbered the Georgians were if this exaggeration can be stretched that far. Some Turkish sources claim it was a mere 30,000 men, but this is far too low of an exaggeration. Another number comes at 250,000, which would not be totally impossible, but considering the growing fragility of the Seljuk realm, I find it highly unlikely. My most reasonable guess, which is all you can give in this situation, is still a massive army of somewhere around 60,000 men, and upwards of even 100,000. Which remains highly unlikely, but still not impossible. The truth is, we'll likely never know the scale of this battle without more tangible evidence, and anyone who tells you anything different is lying to you. While the size of Didgori remains a mystery, its impact on the history of the Caucasus region, and the Middle East as a whole, cannot be understated. David, a master of guerrilla warfare and ambush, would put these abilities on full display on the biggest stage of his military career. Before the battle could even begin, a small group of Kipchaks arrived at the Seljuk camp. Proclaiming their desertion, they were quickly met by the leaders of the Islamic coalition. They ensured that the Georgian army was still a few days' march away, soothing the nerves of these generals. Until they reached for their bows in a simultaneous motion and shot down the entire command structure of the Seljuk horde, with the exception of Ilghazi himself. As the Kipchaks quickly rode away, Ilghazi mustered the whole army, who had seen this entire affair go down, to action. They followed the fleeing Kipchaks, who ducked into a nearby valley, and as Ilghazi turned the corner, he realized he had just fallen into a trap. What appeared to be the entire Georgian army was now within earshot. King David, with assistance from his nomadic allies, had just concocted one of the greatest feigned retreat ambushes in history. The Georgian line they now faced was complemented by nearly all of the Kipchaks present that day, with the infantry supporting just behind them. At the very front, of course, was the Frankish lances, who David hoped would shatter the Seljuk center. The only thing absent from this formidable surprise army was the king himself, nor was the crown prince in sight. Too far to turn back now, Ilghazi took his chance and charged at his enemy, picking up speed and delving ever deeper into that wooded valley. As Kipchak arrows softened the Seljuks, the Frankish lances hit home and Turkish sabers clashed on either side. While the center lines on both sides did manage to hold, this would not last as King David IV appeared from the forest closest to where the Seljuks had entered the valley. Calling the soldiers of Christ with an inspiring speech, his elite Manaspa guard crashed into the Seljuks, nearly cutting off their retreat. As the Seljuk army turned to face this new ambush, a volley of arrows appeared at their backs. To complete the encirclement on the opposite side of the valley, Prince Demetrius sprung from the hills with a few thousand Georgian heavy cavalry and Kipchak mounted missiles. In a devastating downhill charge, the final trap had been sprung. The Seljuk army was nearly surrounded, and Didgori looked more like a valley of death with every moment. Ilghazi, who had been injured during the initial charge, seeing that he had been simply and masterfully outmaneuvered, retreated the field to fight another day, although he would never make the mistake of confronting Georgia in battle ever again. While the battle was now decided, it was nowhere near over. It took the Georgian coalition a grueling 3 hours to cut through the Seljuk army, finally surrounding around 4,000 of them and forcing their surrender. But it was never enough to just win for David. The Turks had to be driven out completely. For 3 days, the Kipchaks chased the Seljuks from Georgia, killing thousands more as they caught up with them. Finally, the Battle of Didgori was the miraculous victory King David had so desperately craved for his entire reign. After nearly 50 years of strife and turmoil, the Seljuk threat could no longer challenge Georgia. With the jihad broken, David Bagrationi was now the undisputed Christian champion of the Caucasus Mountains. Still, there was even a grander victory that every king of Georgia up until this point could only dream of. Tbilisi was finally within grasp. David had been blockading the emirate and slowly chipping away at their forts until only the hot springs citadel remained. In a month, Georgian soldiers reclaimed the gates of their ancient capital city for the first time in over 400 years. With so much time passed, David entered a very different looking Tbilisi than he was expecting. The few churches in the city were dwarfed by the mosque and crescents that surrounded him. Very rarely did David IV meet a civilian population with violence. Even Islamic sources are friendly towards David, who more often preferred integration or coexistence, rather than terror. However, this is his worst offense of the kind. For a day, he let his soldiers have free rein to sack the city, barring any churches, of course. The majority Muslim population responded to this, as the sword of the Messiah was pressed against them. After the day was won and followed up in a bloody display of revenge, David halted his army and committed no more atrocities on the coveted city of the Georgians. On this second day, David declared that Tbilisi would once again be the capital of the Kartvelians, moving the royal estates from his birth town of Kutaisi. This was perhaps the most momentous day in the history of Georgia. David had restored and now fully reconquered all Georgian possessions from their storied past, and beyond that. While the Seljuk threat was finally at rest, King David IV never was. The Reconquista had been nothing short of a near miracle campaign. But there were more nearby Christian brethren not yet liberated, and a power vacuum in need of filling. Shuffling closer to the edge, the call of empire beckoned the Georgians at last. The crowds gathered by day and turned into mobs by the light of the torch. Another night of anger and outburst was in store for Tbilisi. Muslim and Christian alike could both claim the guilt, for the graves were being filled and placed atop were crosses, while the crescents that adorned the mosques clanked onto the ground below. A few months previous, King David IV Bagrationi had defeated a jihad at Didgori, and sent Ilghazi hurt and running in fear, from which he would eventually die from his wounds only a year later. The path to take Tbilisi, one of the largest cities in the world at this point, was open, and David did so in under a month, after a night of massacre where the mosques were looted and the Muslim ruling elite were killed or enslaved. But by the next day, David had changed his tune and halted the sacking of the city, making way for Tbilisi to be the capital of the Georgians once more. But that initial day of pillaging sparked a rivalry in the city that had been put to rest some 400 years ago. Muslims, Christians, and Jews all met some kind of persecution in this multi-ethnic melting pot. King David IV was no stranger to violence and seemingly relished in war, but unmotivated killing was something he could not stomach, and especially not in his new capital. While David was utterly uncompromising with the Seljuk Turks, exceptions were made for the thousands in Tbilisi, who now lived in fear. The city would receive a tax break, as their citizenry only had to pay a grand total of 10,000 dinars yearly. Looking at the opposite perspective, the Muslims had ruled the city for centuries since the days of the Almighty Caliphate. You can't just erase 400 years of influence, barring a wholesale genocide. So to ease the majority Muslim population, they were only made to pay 3 dinars yearly. The Jews of the city would pay 4, while the Georgians themselves, and any Christian for that matter, was to pay 5 dinars. The killing of pigs in the city was also made illegal. Perhaps the most important thing David did to get Tbilisi to stop purging itself was to reappoint the Emir of Tbilisi as a governor over the city. After a rough start, Tbilisi was smoothly being integrated into Georgia, although it would remain likely the most diverse city in the Caucasus. All this while David was a best friend of the Crusaders. He was walking a fine line between the religious fervor that surrounded him. King David was not only a great conqueror, but perhaps an even better integrator. Despite the miraculous and crushing victory at Didgori, the Seljuk Turks unexpectedly returned that next year. To get a job done right, you gotta do it yourself. And that's exactly what Sultan Mahmud II was thinking as he marched at the head of an army into their old vassal of Shirvan. This sudden offensive could not be met by the Georgian army in time before the Seljuks took Shamaki and captured the Shirvanite royal family, which included David's daughter, his grandchildren, and son-in-law, Shirvanshah Manachor III. This was now beyond personal, and it got even more so with the taunting letter Sultan Mahmud sent to his Georgian counterpart. He stated, "You are the king of the forest, and you never go down to the plains. Now, I have taken Shirvanshah, and I demand tribute from him. If you wish, send me suitable presents. If not, come and see me in all haste." In all haste, David now assembled the speedy Kipchaks and marched day and night to save his family. Holding his rival's daughter hostage, Mahmud thought himself safe from the Seljuk slayer. But with his bluff now called, all the Sultan could do now was hunker down in Shamaki and see if King David would actually jeopardize his family's life by putting the city to the siege. As David neared closer, the Sultan sent a completely opposite and honestly embarrassing letter to the Georgians. Mahmud would hand over Shirvan and give up the hostages if they would just please let him go back with his head. David IV never responded. A relief army of 4,000 in the form of Aaron intercepted the Kipchaks before they reached Shamaki. But this outnumbered force was easily defeated and made their retreat back to Ganja. Soon enough, King David arrived before the walls and started preparations to begin a siege. Now, outnumbered, in enemy territory, and facing the best general of his time and place, Sultan Mahmud did something even more embarrassing that night than beg for his life. The almighty Seljuks, who once ruled from Samarkand to Jerusalem and struck fear in the hearts of all sensible men, were now crawling through their own shit to escape. Wading through the subterranean sewer system, Sultan Mahmud came out on the other side, although much smellier and likely fuming in rage. He did manage to escape back to the safety of his country, and left David's family exactly where he had found them in Shamaki. After winning the underdog battle of the century at Didgori, David had now personally shat on the Seljuk Emperor. If it wasn't clear before, then it certainly was now. Georgia no longer took any kind of order or threat from the Seljuk Turks. With his family now safe, no thanks to Shirvan Shah Manachor, David decided to annex the western half of Shirvan directly into the Kingdom of Georgia. This, in turn, caused a local rebellion, but it was quickly dealt with. Despite multiple falls from power and loss of key territories, the Shirvan Shahs would remain highly autonomous as long as they were a Georgian vassal. After this attack on the capital, Manachor III would build Baku, the current-day capital of Azerbaijan. While the Seljuks were run out of Shirvan, they still held one stronghold in the southern reaches of modern-day Georgia, Dmanisi. Alongside Prince Demetrius, David took this fortress town and officially ended the Georgian Reconquista. All this before making what was possibly his biggest single land grab. With no Seljuk armies and little to no garrisons in sight, the province of Artsakh fell. Most of Aran, Sinuk, and finally Dizak. As he had failed to take Aran's capital of Ganja some 10 years ago, so too would David fail here. With the Enclave Emirate of Tbilisi absorbed into the Georgian realm, the Enclave simply traveled down the southern trade road to Ganja, and from there, a sliver of land to connect Aran to their Seljuk overlords. If he had committed to it, with his full strength, King David probably would have smoked Ganja. But the power vacuum in the Caucasus needed to be filled before the Seljuks regained their strength. And there were far more willing people than the Kurds of Aran in need of liberation. He had already liberated some of them, but now it was officially time to join together the two most powerful native Christian entities in the region, Georgia and Armenia. The Armenians had long suffered under Seljuk rule, most of them having moved from their homeland to another in Cilicia. Now, with Turkish power crushed, what remained looked over at Georgia and their half-Armenian ruling dynasty as a savior. In May of 1124, King David made his first foray into Armenia proper. He went along his own border from east to west, taking Seljuk garrisons and picking up Armenian soldiery as he went. Upon reaching his own territories on the other side, he then just backtracked from west to east, shaving more away from northern Armenia. After these two blitzkrieg-esque campaigns, the city of Ani was on the Georgian doorstep. Soon enough, the Armenians of the old Bagrationi capital began writing to David Bagrationi. The city of 1,001 churches had been conquered by the Byzantines and leveled by Alp Arslan, who then sold the city to the Kurdish Shadadid family that ruled from Ganja, who just so happened to be one of medieval Armenia's most heated rivals. The Shadadids forcefully converted what was left of the depopulated Ani to Islam and taxed the city senselessly. They had tried to resell the city when it was clear that David would take it, but no one dared get in the way of his warpath. The Armenians of Ani were more than willing to hand over the city. All David had to do was show up at the gates. This he did swiftly, and as promised, the Armenians brought the Kurdish Emir of Ani to them in chains, giving David the keys of the city without a single fight. From here on out, David would be referred to as the King of Georgia and Armenia, although he would only ever control the northern half of Armenia proper. The Cathedral of Ani the largest remaining standing structure, was converted to a mosque. This David returned to the Armenians as a place to worship their apostolic faith. The city of 1001, now demolished churches, was in the hands of the descendants of Bagrat once more. Annie would begin a rebuild, but never again would they reach the splendor from 101 years ago. Not only did this victory cement Georgia's rule over northern Armenia, but it also reimagined Georgian-Armenian relations on the whole. The governance of the city would be passed on to the Abuleti noble family, who had fled Armenia during the Seljuk invasion. Northern Armenia as a whole would see a return to the old ruling elite, as dispossessed Armenian noble houses were re-given their fiefs. By the end of it, the Georgian secular court would nearly have as many Armenian members as Georgian ones. The two most powerful and lasting Christian nations in the Caucasus now had each other's backs completely. United, there was little that could stand in their way. On top of re-giving Armenia to their own, David also wanted these brethren much closer to home. Not far from Tbilisi, David practically built the city of Gori and gave it to the Armenians, so they could settle somewhere much safer than their constantly fought over homeland. While the conquest of Annie and northern Armenia would only see benefits for both parties, an attempt was made to integrate the Armenian Church into Georgian Orthodoxy. A dragging 9-hour debate was held between the best theologians from either side, but none could convince the Monophysite Armenians into conversion. Giving two separate churches jurisdiction in Georgia was a compromise David IV was willing to make. With the conquest of Annie, Georgia was no longer a kingdom. They were, in every sense of the term, a full-blown empire. And perhaps one of the most powerful in the world at this point. But what is an empire exactly? There is no set definition. But my explanation of an empire is a regional superpower, check, who rules over multiple ethnic groups, check, and is influential beyond its own borders, check, check, and check. King David, despite his close alliance to the Byzantines, would take one of their titles, calling himself the ruler of the East and West. But his full title was King of Kings of the Abkhazians, Iberians, Iranis, Kakhetians, Armenians, of Shaki, Alania, and the Rus, Sword of the Messiah, Emperor of all the East, the invincible, servant and defender of God, the Orthodox King. All this seems pretty accurate, but I'm not exactly sure where David is coming from saying that he is the king of the Rus. Perhaps these were leftover settlers from the Viking expedition to Georgia under the reign of David's grandfather? Or maybe some Rus just happened to settle in Abkhazia. But with the birth of a stretching empire, there comes more foes to put it to the test. Another coalition was building, not under the Seljuks or a jihad, but in the strange world that is the Northeast Caucasus. Here, the settling of the Kipchaks finally came back to haunt the Georgians. They found allies in local Kurdish populations, as well as a people we have yet to discuss, the Lezgin. A people who paid tribute to the Kipchaks but were largely left to their own devices. They inhabited the region just to the north of Shirvan and just to the west of Derbent, and have lived here since at least the Bronze Age. They followed a strict moral code of 5 tenets called the Lezgawal. The attributes one was expected to practice were faith, honor, respect, mercy, and valor. Sounds awfully like a mountaineer version of chivalry if you ask me. Some believe the Lezgin to be the original Caucasus Albanians, who seemingly disappeared during the initial Arab conquest of the region. Secluded in their mountains, they held on to their culture and animist religion throughout the centuries despite multiple invasions. But now, Faced with joining an empire, their small state became a military base for anyone left in the North Caucasus who despised Georgian hegemony. Soon enough, unprovoked, the Lezgin attacked the Georgian vassal of Derbent and raided its westernmost territories. This offensive prompted King David to action. In a campaign unlike any other he had faced, the Georgians would fight a grueling war of attrition on the mountaintops. Not much information survives regarding the Lezgin campaign, but one thing can be deduced that would have made this war that much harder to win. Due to the anti-Georgian Kipchaks he faced, David likely left his own horse archers behind to prevent more of their desertion. Despite this, the Georgians took 2 Lezgin forts, which was nearly half of their territory, before returning home. Even with this setback, the Kipchak and Kurdish portion of the coalition remained at large and had support from Ganja. Together they attacked Shirvan, and like before with the Seljuks, Shirvan Shah Manachor could do nothing against his invader. Instead of being taken hostage along with he and David's family, he evacuated the capital and left it for the Kurd Kipchaks to loot, which they gladly did. But soon enough, King David came to save Manachor for a second time and kicked out the invaders. Putting an end to the disruption in the North Caucasus, he reinforced the garrisons in Kakheti and Hereti, before turning to face another threat. By the end of the northern conflict, the warrior King David IV began showing signs of a serious sickness. We aren't exactly sure what he had, but his 50 years on Earth were beginning to show. But so too did his experience shine through, even as this illness began to overtake him. In January of 1125, the Shah Armens, the Seljuk governors of southern Armenia, gathered enough strength to challenge the conquest of Ani made in the previous year. King David took the battlefield one last time, and even in a frail state, he did not disappoint. The invaders, who came with multiple armies, invaded Georgian Armenia. David IV pushed back all of them in just 5 days of combat. Without a moment's hesitation, the king separated from his army and traveled with his closest companions to Tbilisi as fast as they could ride. Just like his own father had, David IV gave his firstborn son, Demetrius Bagrationi, the noble regalia. But for some reason, he was not ready to give up his crown. And I don't blame him. As Demetrius looked into the exhausted face of the once formidable figure that was his father, he saw firsthand what this heavy task could do to the most energetic of kings. A few days later, at the age of only 51, David IV Bagrationi passed away after nearly 36 years of reign. He would be buried in his unfinished Jalati monastery, alongside his tutor George of Chonditi. His tomb is located under the very entrance of Jalati itself. It's only fitting that King David the Builder was built into his own church. His epitaph reads, "Christ, this is my resting place for eternity. It pleases me. Here I shall dwell." Another stone carving nearby referring to David reads, "He who at Nacharmagavi Castle united for our sustenance 7 kings, who chased over our borders Turks, Persians, Arabs, who brought us fish from the waters over the mountains to the waters on the other side. The man who achieved those things now has me placing his arms across his heart. And here he remains, his arms crossed to this day." David IV, despite his premature death, is widely regarded as Georgia's greatest monarch. Every future ruler would try to emulate his reign as the standard for all Georgian mepes to follow. But I see David not only as Georgia's greatest king, but quite possibly one of the greatest monarchs and generals of all time. Before Didgori, he was the underdog in nearly every battle, and consistently came out on top. He was loved by his Georgian subjects and praised for his openness by Muslims and Jews alike. He was a scholar and theological student of all faiths. He read the Quran in its entirety, and still is considered a saint in the Georgian Orthodox Church, and even some in the West. He was the true architect of a nation and an empire. While David IV was certainly a larger-than-life figure, something overshadowed by his accomplishments is that David was a human with real human emotions. He had plenty of guilt to go around. After all, there was a brutal and scheming side to David as any king. This is stated best by Donald Rayfield in his book, Edge of Empires. David then created the Mistovarni, meaning informers, an intelligence service under the Minister for Internal Affairs. It defeated the nobility's plots and gave the king a true picture of what was happening in his army and church. Well advised by counselors like his tutor George, David nipped trouble in the bud. Nobody dared speak out, even to their spouse, for it would certainly come to the king's knowledge. Nobody ever plotted. Everyone was wary about everything. Plotters were punished by blinding, castration, and execution. Nothing demonstrates David's own feelings and personality better than the hymns of repentance. 5 years before his death, likely after the Battle of Didgori, David compiled these hymns. Most of them have the overtones of sin and guilt, as every good religious text at this time demonstrates. It also shows that David really thought he was some sort of incarnation of the biblical David. But it goes farther and leaves us with David's personal insight on himself. I will give a few of the most important lines in the hymns of repentance. By thee I have been granted my crown and my kingship, but I have succumbed, like a slave to filthy lust, for he that has been defeated is a slave to his conqueror. Emulating the kings of Israel, in their lawlessness alone, I sinned without restraint. I incensed the heights, I consorted with pagans and worshipped the power of heaven. In reference to himself in battle, I became like a monster, a fusion of various beasts multifarious and many-faced in their image and ferocity, reflecting the nature of each beast enclosed within me. I did not quail before the smiting sickle, threatening death to those like one who constantly swears false oaths by thy miraculous name. In reference to the empire he created, insatiable like Solomon's horse leech, I strove to subjugate alien lands. In my greed and lust, I considered small and insignificant the original bounds ordained by God. I violated borders arrogantly and joined house to house and laid field to field. I took from the infirm their share, thinking of one thing only, that I alone should dwell upon this earth. I arose against all laws by sinful evil doing. I defiled my bed, giving a bad example to my people. I disgraced them, as the kings of Israel disgraced their people. In regards to the hardships of warfare, I took no pity on the tears of widows, nor on the weeping and moans of orphans. I opened not my heart to the needy. Finally, we leave David IV Bagrationi with his thoughts of his own mortality and the future of Georgia under his son. When comes the time of the elements raging wild, when the end has come of the reign of a king, then the glory of kings has faded. Then joys are past and flowers are faded. Another will take up the scepter, and the army will follow another. Then have mercy upon me, O my judge. If you'd like to support this stoic historian, feel free to do so on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. And join Derek Clark, Savak Leo Nazarian, Taj Guilford, Nick Matt Vossian, Lazarus Dykos, Dave J. Dalinar, and Moist Lord. Or become a YouTube channel member like Derek Clark again, Donald Vincent. What? Why? Nickmate Vossian again, God, Heath Hothead 9 Dion, and Carl Cleric 61 Brandian. Thank you guys for supporting the channel. I really appreciate it.